We are going to take a look at 10 of the worst cards in Pokemon TCG Pocket and a few others that I just wanted to throw in there and talk about. It's going to be a controversial but very spicy list, so come along with me, Jake, your resident content cowboy here. Yeehaw, let's do this thing. Oh, and before we jump into our list, I should mention that I think some of these actually could find some value depending on metagame shifts and more cards being released that interact with them. I would love to hear from you. If there's something that made my list that you think is insane, or is there something that should have made my list, please let me know in the comments. Now, 10 Pokemon that are and a few others that are pretty fun to talk about as well. Alright, let's talk about Go-Goat. Go-Goat and Skidoo. So, this is look at these two cards here. Okay, this card is a basic, 70 HP, not too bad, 1 retreat cost, weak to fire. Its attack does 40 damage, maybe. It's colorless energy, so I guess there's a little bit of a bonus there, but this does like a questionable amount of damage where Farfetch'd would do it definitely, and Kangaskhan would have the opportunity to possibly do 60 with 100 HP. Then you have Go-Goat. It is a 3 energy, stage 1. I guess its HP is all right, 120. I don't hate that. It still has a 2 retreat cost, and its energy is not all colorless, so you have to run it in a grass deck. This just feels like a really confusing one, and I have not seen anyone run this effectively. It feels pretty weak, honestly. Another grass Pokemon that feels a little tough to run is Tangela. So it's a basic, which I think is cool, but it requires 2 energy to do 40 damage, and it's only healing yourself for 10. There aren't a ton of opportunities to heal this Pokemon, given that it only has 80 HP. I don't think you're going to be out brawling a lot with this, and 2 is just a high energy cost. Maybe if this did 30 damage and it healed for 10 or something for 1 energy, this could be a nice early game Pokemon. Instead, you're gonna have to spend multiple turns powering this up. And again, it requires grass energy, so you can't put it in a lot of different decks. Tangela is a tough one. Next, I want to talk about Swanney and Ducklett. So Swanney is 90 HP, a stage 1 Pokemon that requires 3 colorless energy to do 70 damage. I guess my thought here with this in general is, when do you want to use this? Like, what deck are you trying to use this in? I could see maybe trying to slot this into a deck that doesn't run water Pokemon but wants to run Misty. So you could power up Swanney, but you also have colorless energy for it, and maybe it's a little tricky because everything else in your deck kind of can counter lightning so that you can play this, or I guess I just can't figure out a good way to use this. I wish I could. I think it's a cool idea for a card, but especially with that lightning weakness and lightning being so prevalent in the game, I just don't see a lot of opportunity to run Ducklett or Swanney, especially Ducklett. It's a basic, it costs 2 energy to only do 30 damage with only 50 HP. It's a lot of investment for not a lot of output. This one breaks my heart a little bit because I love the idea behind the deck, but it's Nidoqueen. Nidoking, I think, actually does a little bit better, but Nidoqueen is set up specifically to play with Nidoking, and it just requires so many things to be going your way to be able to play this and get value out of it. So you have to get a stage 2 Pokemon on the board with 3 energy, while at the same time you have to get another stage 2 Pokemon on your bench, ideally 2 other stage 2 Pokemons on your bench. And Pokemon, by the way, I was once reprimanded on a Unite broadcast for saying Pokemons. It's a slip of the tongue. I know that multiple Pokemon are Pokemon, but here we are accidentally saying Pokemons again. So you need to get 2 Pokemons on your bench that are also stage 2, and that is just really tough to do. You have to have so many cards draw your way. I guess the nice thing about this is Nidoran female does give you the ability to pull Nidoran males from your deck to your bench, but even still, this entire line I feel like is a mess. So it attacks as Nidorina for 1 dark energy, doing 30 damage. Not terrible, but this could probably be 40, and that really wouldn't be broken. But at the same time, you need 3 energy for Nidoqueen anyway. So you're kind of maybe trying to power it up on your bench, while at the same time you're getting your Nidoking out, and they're all stage 2, and it's just all a mess. If there was anything to help this dark deck, I would love to see it, hopefully maybe in like the next mini expansion, we see something for it, because I think the idea of this combination, you know, having fully evolved Pokemon on your bench makes a fully evolved Pokemon in your active spot even more powerful. Like, this is a cool, exciting combination. It is just one of the hardest things to set up in Pokemon Pocket, and for that reason I do think Nidoqueen is super underwhelming. Next, we're taking a look at Rattata and Raticate. So Rattata is a 40 HP basic that only does 20 damage. I mean, it's colorless, but besides that, there's really nothing going on. And then Raticate is a stage 1 with 80 HP doing 40 damage. It just feels like such a nothing card, and I'm not even sure why you would run it over Kangaskhan, why you'd run it over Farfetch. And in a game where you only have 20 cards in your deck, I do think you need to make decisions like, why am I running this? I guess if there was some sort of normal trainer or Pokemon or something, normal support card that made you do more damage or something based on the amount of colorless Pokemon you had, I don't know. The point is, Rattata and Raticate just do not cut the mustard in Pokemon Pocket, and I don't know a single deck you'd run them in. This next one is a weird one, but it's Jigglypuff. Now, I think Wigglytuff EX is actually pretty good, but Jigglypuff as a basic Pokemon that requires 2 colorless energy to do 30 damage is just kind of bad. I cannot wait for the promo Jiggly to come to the game. If you've not seen it, the promo Jiggly gives you the ability to put your opponent to sleep. It's not doing damage, but it only costs 1 energy, and I think that is so much better than a weird 2 colorless energy to do almost no damage Pokemon. Right now, Jiggly is the unfortunate part of Wigglytuff EX. Next, we're going to talk about Ditto. Ditto is such a mess. It seems like a cool Pokemon, and I know some people have made some really fun decks with it. You've got like a cool video where you put some psychic energy on Ditto, and then all of a sudden you're using Mewtwo's attack. Like, the idea behind Ditto is cool. The problem with Ditto is, not only do you need the amount of energy your opponent has, which makes a lot of sense, you need the exact type of energy they need. So there are so many decks that you could run Ditto in that do absolutely nothing. In a tournament setting, I could see some exciting plays with it if you know a lot of what you're running into in the meta, right? And you could switch your energy before a match. But in general, I just think Ditto is a real mess. It's a fun idea for a card, it really is, but when you need the exact same type of energy, it just makes this so unbelievably difficult to get value out of. Again, I've seen a few cool decks, don't get me wrong, I think the idea is fun, but it's just like, yeah, you ran into a water deck. Well, nothing you can do there, because you don't have that energy. So whoops. I want to talk about 2 cards right here that I think are kind of bait, and that is Chansey and Snorlax. I don't think either of these are awful cards, but I wanted to add them to my list just to discuss them. People will often try to throw Snorlax as a wall for their decks, but against any good deck, like most good decks, they have an answer to something like this. Your big problem with Snorlax or Chansey is that they require an insane amount of energy to switch out. So Snorlax has a 4 colorless retreat, and you can think like, well, I'm setting up on my bench, that's fine. It's like, kinda, I guess that could be fine, unless your opponent is setting up Charizard on the other side, or Mewtwo on the other side, or they have, you know, Greninja, or Zebstrika, or Seadra or something, and they're just doing insane damage to your bench. Like, I feel like there are lots of situations where someone plays Snorlax, and they think, haha, I've got this really powerful wall, and in reality, your opponent goes, okay, I don't care about that at all. I'll start beating you when I feel like it. Until then, you can't even switch your Pokemon in. There's nothing you can do with this big wall. Until we have like some sort of Pokeflute card that you'll be able to pull Snorlax back with, I do think this card has some value, don't get me wrong. It's not one of the worst, but I also think there's a lot of times where this card is bait. Looking at our trainer cards here, there aren't too many that I think are bad. I think Pokédex is a tough one. Looking at the top 3 cards of your deck does give you some pretty interesting information, and if you use something that shuffles your deck around, hey, I kind of get where you're coming from here. This just feels like an awkward one to put into a deck, because rather than looking at the top 3 cards of my deck, I just want something that lets me draw something from my deck, or something that affects the battlefield more. I think this card is unfortunate, not awful, but I guess, I mean, when I think about it, I don't know too many times I would really want to run this card at all. Red card is another one. Now, don't get me wrong. Red card does not make my list of like awful cards or anything like that. This is one of those cards that I just have to point out can have just as many times this gives you negative value as it gives you positive value. And I think people who get really good at the game do start to understand when to red card, and they find a lot of value in that. But you also have to understand, sometimes your opponent has drawn, like, they've got 5 cards in their hand or whatever, and they're none of the 5 cards they need, right? And that's the reason they still have 5 cards sitting in their hand. There are other times where you can throw a red card and your opponent's like, oh no, I had Charmeleon and Charizard EX in my hand, like I was ready to go. That can happen, but just as often, you just gave your opponent an actual good hand when they had a bad hand. Again, this doesn't make my list, but I feel like we did need to talk about red card because, I mean, I think people overvalue this card considerably. I feel like Lickitung has to make this list, even though Lickitung does give you the ability to do the most damage possible in the game, which is essentially infinite if you just continue to flip heads. But at the same time, this card takes so much energy and it can easily do 0 damage. So while I think this is very fun and cheesy, there's no question that Lickitung is a pretty awful card. The biggest thing I think is the energy requirement. If this was 2 energy, I think you'd probably gamble on a Pokemon like this a lot. But given that it is 3 energy, it takes a long time to power up and it can easily do nothing and get one shot. It's just a bit of a mess. Here's a card that I think is worth talking about, and that is Mienfao. I don't really know exactly what the Mienfoo, Mienfao thought process here is. I get that they use a colorless energy, so you can slot a fighting card into your deck, but it's a stage 1, and at basic, it does 20 damage with 60 HP, extremely low, and then its stage 1 does 40 damage. The nice thing about it is 1 energy, so I would love to actually hear from you in the comments. Is there any deck that you've been slotting this into and having some really good results with? It just feels like a lot for a little, and it also just feels like, you know, square peg round hole. Like, what decks do you really fit this into and get value from? Now, this is a controversial one, but I don't see a lot of value in Mew. So here's the thing. The cool thing about Mew is you will use this card, you will do a very small amount of damage. It's a basic Pokemon, and if you do this 20 damage, your opponent will reveal their hand to you. At the end of your turn, they will reveal their hand. So I guess you do get some information, but you give your opponent an entire turn to do whatever they want with those cards. Yeah, there's something to this. There's something to this and pairing it with red card basically and having that extra bit of information. And I would like to try to use it more, but again, this isn't something you do at the start of your turn and gives you ludicrous amounts of information about what's about to happen. This is something that happens at the end of your turn when you are giving your opponent plenty of time to use those cards or do whatever they were planning on doing. I just think Mew is unfortunately not great. Now, this one breaks my heart, but I do have to talk about Gyarados. Gyarados is an extremely expensive card. It is 4 water energy to do 100 damage. It is a small amount of damage for 4 energy. It's a stage 1, it's not EX, which is cool, but gosh, it just takes so much to get this thing online, and then once it's online, it really isn't doing that much. Even when you're discarding 1 energy from your opponent, oftentimes their Pokemon is in play, and 1 energy isn't going to make the difference because after you attack, it's their turn and they're able to put the energy back on. I would love to see Gyarados EX or something because Gyarados is like a top Pokemon. Do I have it back here? Where's my Gary? Oh, it's right here. I've got my Gary right here. So I do love me some Gyarados. I would just really like this card to actually do something. I feel like it's so much setup for such little payoff. I'm sorry, Gary, but you just don't do much. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I love you, and I'll see y'all next time. We did it.